This week begins the 2020 census, an aim to count everyone living in the country and the U.S. territories. The findings will determine how federal dollars are distributed. Hansi Lo Wang, a national correspondent for NPR, has been reporting on the 2020 census. We sat down recently to discuss what to expect, including what's new this time around.
It's a basic set of questions that's going to ask you where you live, confirming your address, all the people living in your home, their age, birth date, phone number that someone could be reached at, race, ethnicity, and the relationship that between people living in the same home, as well as whether the home's rented or owned. Some of the changes are in the race question. If you mark off the white and or the black box to answer the race question, for the first time, the Census Bureau is going to ask within the context of race what your origins are, and those are non-Hispanic origins. They provide examples such as English or French or Jamaican or Nigerian, for example, asking them to write those in. And under the relationship question, describing how people within the same household are related, there's going to be new categories that specify same sex and what the Bureau is calling opposite sex, spouse, wife, husband, partner. That's the first time the Census Bureau is asking for people to identify their sexual orientation directly in the context of this relationship question.
Okay, so there is not a citizenship question in this census. Is there another way? Are there other ways that the government is going to come up with some sort of an estimate on that data?
The government's going to try. President Trump issued an executive order once he announced that the administration was no longer pushing for this citizenship question that federal courts have now permanently blocked from being added to the 2020 census forms. And so the Census Bureau has been working to try to compile existing government records from various federal agencies, including the State Department, Department of Homeland Security, as well as some state DMV offices, and trying to come up with a data set that would represent the citizenship status of every person living in the country.
And it's sort of very basic, but this is not happening on Facebook. There were campaign ads from the Trump administration earlier this week, I think, that Facebook decided to take off. But this is not going to be through Facebook. This isn't going to be through an email. This is going to be something that you're going to have to go to this one and only website to fill out, correct?
That's right. The official 2020 census online form is a website. It's not an app. It's my2020census.gov. You can access it, the Census Bureau says, from any web browser. And those ads from the Trump administration's re-election campaign, those were ads directing to a survey that was calling itself some kind of, quote, official census, but it was not the official census.
So what happens for people that don't understand the process? What happens when a census taker knocks on the door and there's nobody home? How do we get information on who lives in this community?
Well, these census workers are not going to go out until around mid-May, so the next few months, everyone's on their own, Bureau hopes to self-respond, but starting in mid-May and into the summer, households that haven't responded by then, the census worker is going to try and knock on that door multiple times. And also, if ultimately the census worker can't find someone at their home, they may ask neighbors, landlords, other what the Census Bureau calls proxies, to try to help understand who is actually living in that home. Also going to use, for the first time, more extensive use of existing government records to try to fill in those gaps.
This is happening. About 500,000 temps are required to do all that door knocking. And this is happening in the context of a coronavirus scare, which is going through the country. Any possibilities that that could impact how the results come out?
Something I'm watching right now, and 500,000 workers is what the Bureau is expecting to need if the response rate, actually self-response rate, is even lower than 60%, about 55%, and that's of households they're expecting to self-respond. And so it's a big question if the Census Bureau, right now, it's supposed to be ramping up hiring. It's recruited more than 2 million applicants, and now starting to offer positions to these applicants to see if anyone will take them and go through training over the next few months and to be deployed in May. We'll see how that turns out.
How do we count homeless people?
It's a complicated process, and towards the end of March this month, the Census Bureau is going to do two different things. One is going to visit shelters, which they've contacted so far in transitional homes, for example, and try to figure out a way, working with those shelters, to figure out the best way to count the residents or the people who use those facilities. That could be sending a census worker to do in-person interviews. It could be distributing paper forms and then collecting them at the end. And then certainly there are folks who are living not in shelters, living on the streets. And the Census Bureau does have a one-day count on around April 1st, and when they're going to visit places where they're more likely to find folks who are homeless and try to do a count there.
And really kind of the bottom line of this is that this is very consequential for how communities get money from the federal government and how we really think about lots of other things that have big consequences going forward the next 10 years.
You know, one way to think about the census, it's a way for every person living in the United States of America to express power. The Constitution, Article 1, Section 2, is calling for an actual enumeration, actual counting of every person living in the country. And those numbers determine how many congressional seats and electoral college votes each state gets, and it guides more than $1.5 trillion a year for Medicare, Medicaid, roads, and schools. And it's all dependent upon how many people are living in the country.
All right, Hansi Luong, thanks so much.
You're welcome.